Okay, so we are in the week of November 9th through the 12th. We're covering nervous tissue, brain, spinal cord, and spinal reflexes this week. And that corresponds in your lab manual to exercises 11, 12, and 13. You'll have a mastering A&P homework due this week over exercise 12. All right, next week you'll have a quiz over sections 11, 12, and 13 over nervous tissue in the brain and the spinal cord. All right. All right. So we're starting with nervous system. Okay. All right, so here are some structures you need to be aware of. The nervous system, this one's of the neuron. Some of you have neurons on your tables. We've got kind of different stations where you can walk around later. All right, but here's your cell body, also known as the soma of the neuron. You have dendrites, and dendrites receive information, axons send information. Typically you have many dendrites, one axon. Okay, there's the nucleus, it's mitochondria. Okay, missile bodies, which is Ruffyar and ribosomes. Okay, some intermediate filaments there. Neurofibrils going toward the axon. All right, this is the axon hillock. Okay, it's kind of the base of the axon. The cytoplasm in the axon is called axoplasm. The cell membrane on the axon is called axolemma. Okay, this whole thing is the axon. These particular areas that are in yellow, we call those nodes. And the areas in between these larger areas, we call those myelin sheaths or internodes. Okay, nodes are also known as axon collaterals. Okay, the branches at the end of the axon, we call those telodendria. And then the actual endings, we call those axon terminals. Okay, and these are some target cells that this neuron is synapsing with. Okay. Okay, a little simpler model here. We got the nucleus in the cell body. All right. Got your dendrites. Here's your axon hillock. This is an internode. It's myelinated. Okay, the spaces with no myelin are the nodes. Okay, you get faster transmission of your action potentials with the myelinated axons. You do a cross section. Here you can see this is a Schwann cell that provides the myelin. It surrounds the axon. Okay. And so once it surrounds it, then it wraps around, forms multiple layers around it. Okay. And another view here. Here's your presynaptic cell, the neuron in the postsynaptic cell. The space in between is the synapse. Again, here's your nucleus on your dendrites. Here's an unmyelinated axon. Again, these branches off the axon are telodendria. The ends are axon terminals or synaptic terminals. All right. So here are satellite cells. Okay, these are type of nervous system cell. Okay, surrounding the dendrites in the cell body. These are Schwann cells surrounding the axon. Okay, it's the nucleus of the Schwann cell. The plasma membrane of the Schwann cell is called neurolemma. And these are individual axons. All right, so this Schwann cell is surrounding multiple axons. All right, so we'll stop there before we get into peripheral nerves. But just I want you to kind of review at your tables and look over parts of the neuron and Schwann cells and satellite cells. You can do that at your table. Okay, so let's now look at peripheral nerve. Again, these are nerves coming off the spinal cord. There's different layers to them. So the epineurium is your tissue surrounding the whole spinal nerve. Okay. Now, tissue surrounding one fascicle. The tissue surrounding one fascicle is perineurium. Okay. Tissue surrounding one axon is endoneurium. Okay, surrounding a whole nerve, epineurium, surrounding one fascicle, perineurium, surrounding one axon, endoneurium. Okay. Okay. Also want to talk about types of cells you'll see in the nervous system. You've got essentially neurons and neuroglial cells. Neurons are sort of the active cells submitting, the active potentials sending information. Neuroglial cells support the neurons. And there's different kinds. You have some of the more common ones are astrocytes, oligodendrocytes, okay, microglial cells, and ependymal cells. Astrocytes look kind of like a star, right? Astrocytes. And they are anchors for neurons and blood vessels. They're going to regulate your extracellular environment outside your cells. They're going to facilitate formation of the blood-brain barrier, so keeping blood separate from your brain tissue. And they help repair damaged tissues in your central nervous system. The oligodendrocytes, right here, myelinate some axons in your central nervous system. Okay, so they provide myelin. Your microglial cells here are phagocytes. Okay, so here's a microglial cell ingesting some particle that the cell perceives as dangerous. Okay. And these are ependymal cells, and they're lining different cavities in your nervous system. And they have cilia that circulate fluid around your brain, your spinal cord. And some ependymal cells will actually secrete that fluid. Okay, here's the cilia. Okay. All right, here's a picture or figure from your textbook. This is definitely a picture you want to know. You may end up seeing images like this. I can't guarantee you'll see this image or what structures you'll have to know, but definitely a figure that I think you should pay some attention to. So here you got in your spinal cord, you've got gray matter and white matter. So in the gray matter, okay, you can see your ependymal cells, your microglial cells, okay. Here in the white matter, you can see, so in the white matter, you can see your axons, because remember white, it's for the myelin. So you have your myelinated axons, your oligodendrocytes that provide the myelin. Okay. Here's an astrocyte. Okay. But definitely want to know these different cell types that you see here. Okay. More on cell types. So in the peripheral nervous system, the other cell microglial or other neuroglial cells I showed you were mostly central nervous system. These are peripheral nervous system. So you have the Schwann cells and the satellite cells. Schwann cells myelinate axons in the peripheral nervous system. Anybody remember what neuroglial cell myelinates axons in the central nervous system?
It's the one with different.
Yes, the oligodendrocytes, yes. And they also have satellite cells that surround the neuron cell bodies, okay? All right. So let's take a pause, talk to your neighbors about different types of neuroglial cells. You can do this at home as well. Okay. Structures you want to know on your spinal cord. In the middle, you've got gray matter. And on the outside, you have your white matter. Okay. Again, that's white because of all the myelinated axons. Okay, these are your peripheral nerves on the outside. So here's your ventral root. Ventral is another word for anterior. Dorsal is another word for posterior. How do you know it's the dorsal root? Because it has this big bulge. Okay, the dorsal root ganglion. All right, and so they'll feed into the dorsal and ventral root, feed into the spinal nerve. Okay, so if you see the ganglion, you know that's dorsal root. Okay. You can also see meninges or layers of covering around the spinal cord. Outer layer here is the dura mater, and it's durable or tough. And you have a webby layer called arachnoid, like a spider web. And then your innermost layer is the pia mater. Okay, so dura mater, arachnoid mater, pia mater. Okay, ventral root, dorsal root ganglion, spinal nerve, gray matter, or sorry, white matter, gray matter. Okay. Okay, another view where you can see in your spinal cord, you have your gray matter and your white matter. There's your dura mater, arachnoid mater, pia mater that's right on the edge of the spinal cord. Again, here's your ventral root, here's your dorsal root because you have the dorsal root ganglion. Okay. This is a sympathetic ganglion. It goes to your sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight response, right? If something's wrong. Okay. Then you've got what we call rami communicantes, connecting the sympathetic nervous or sympathetic ganglion to your dorsal root. Okay. You have these two ends here. We call this a ventral ramus and a dorsal ramus. Again, because it's on the dorsal side with the dorsal root ganglion. Okay, those are also structures you need to be aware of. But also, again, knowing generally this is your spinal cord. Okay, and this is the vertebrae surrounding your spinal cord, right?
Doctor,
yes.
What's the blue layer on top of the yellow?
The blue layer on top of the.
Yes, sir. I'm like, yeah.
Like
yes, sir. Right there.
Okay. So, it's basically, you kind of have like a layer of dura mater. It's not, we don't really call it dura mater. We kind of really say that for brain spinal cord, but you basically, it's kind of a continuous layer that goes toward the peripheral nerves that protects them as well. All right, parts of the spinal cord or sectional organization. Again, this is gray matter, it's white matter. This is posterior. Again, because the dorsal root ganglion, this is posterior. We call this region a posterior white column. This line separating the two columns, we call it a posterior median sulcus. Okay. All right, we have a lateral white horn. Some lateral sides, right? On the sides is lateral. And we have an anterior white column. Now, this big space in between the anterior white columns is the anterior median fissure. Why? Because it's anterior, it's in the front, and it's in the middle, so it's median. It's bigger, so it's a fissure. Now, for the gray matter, we have posterior gray horn, because again, it forms these sort of points here, lateral gray horn, and anterior gray horn. Okay, posterior, lateral, and gray. Okay, now we also have nuclei, or regions where information is processed. Okay, we organize, or the cell bodies in your neurons in the gray matter are organized into functional groups. So you have your sensory nuclei on the dorsal side or posterior side, and the motor nuclei on the ventral side. Somatic sensory information is processed here. Visceral sensory information is processed here. Remember, somatic is skeletal muscle, visceral, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. All right, for motor nuclei, somatic nuclei are here for motor signals for skeletal muscle, motor signals for smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands are located here toward the lateral gray horn. Okay, whereas somatics more toward the anterior gray horn. Okay. All right, so here's another view, same structures. Again, here's your dorsal root ganglion, your dorsal root, which makes this the ventral root. Okay, here's that sympathetic ganglion. So it makes these the rami communicantes, connecting out toward the spinal nerve, which separates into the dorsal ramus and the ventral ramus. Okay, dorsal ramus is going to innervate the back of the body. Ventral ramus is going to innervate the sides and the front. Okay, but you have both a gray ramus and a white ramus that make up your rami communicantes. Okay. All right. If you see here, you got visceral. Remember, this is where the visceral nuclei are. That information feeds to the, so you have your sensory information coming in, goes to the dorsal root ganglion. Fight or flight, a lot of that is turning off some of your autonomic information. That's information is going to the visceral nuclei or visceral motor nuclei. Then you've got motor information going out to the ventral, okay, to the ventral root, because the motor information goes that way. So remember, sensory information through the dorsal root, motor information through the ventral root. All right. So you have different nerves and regions of nerves we want you to know about. So we have your, just like you have cervical vertebrae, we have a cervical plexus, C1 through C4. All right, C4 to T1, it's going to be your brachial plexus. Okay, innervates the arm. T12 or T11 through S4 is your lumbosacral plexus, which is divided up into your lumbar plexus, which is T12 to L4, and your sacral plexus, which is L4 to S4. Okay, so branches off of the brachial plexus you need to know. These are thoracic nerves, because they're, and actually those aren't really off the brachial plexus, but what you need to know off the brachial plexus. On the arm, again, anatomical position, okay? So, nerve on the side where your thumb is gonna be is the radial nerve. On the pinky side is gonna be the ulnar nerve, because that goes toward the ulna. And then in between, you have the medial nerve, okay? Radial, ulnar, and medial, or median. Thoracic region, you have thoracic nerves. Now, coming off of, let's see, looks like L3 and L4, you have your femoral nerve, right? Goes to your femur. And then you've got L3, L4, or L4 or L5 You have the sciatic nerve, okay, going down the middle of your thigh. Femoral kind of winds around, or femoral, yeah, winds around this way toward the medial side of your leg. Okay. Sciatic goes down the middle. All right, so let's take a break, talk about the parts of the spinal cord, as well as the peripheral nerves and nerve plexuses. You can do this at home as well. So one of the things you also need to know is steps in the reflex arc. So in this one, we're getting that stretch reflex or patellar reflex. So you have the arrival of some stimulus, and that's gonna, you have the stimulus here hitting the patella region or that tendon, patellar tendon, and you're activating a stretch receptor. Okay, muscle spindle in your muscle. It's gonna activate a sensory neuron. Okay, it's gonna send a signal to your spinal cord where you have information processing happening. And you're gonna have activation of this motor neuron, sends a signal to the effector where there is a response, in this case, kicking your leg out and extending the knee joint. Okay, another reflex, the Babinski reflex. So essentially, Babinski negative is curling the toes. Babinski positive is fanning out the toes. Okay. So, and this is like if you're rubbing this little piece of metal along the foot, as you know, the line says here, or the arrow. All right. So for adults, plantar reflex is the normal response, toes flexing. But if you have a positive Babinski sign, that's present in adults that have disorders in their upper motor neurons. Okay. All right, let's talk about the brain. So with the brain, parts of the brain you definitely need to know about. And remember, this part of the brain is anterior, this is posterior. This whole region is the frontal lobe, or this whole region is the cerebrum, excuse me. Thinking of the frontal lobe over here. So this is your cerebrum, it's your cerebellum, it's your diencephalon. Okay, then you've got your brainstem. The cerebrum is where your higher mental functions are performed. You're able to interpret sensory stimuli. You're able to plan and initiate different movements. In your diencephalon, you're processing, integrating, and relaying information. Okay, you're also maintaining homeostasis and regulating your biological rhythms. Your cerebellum coordinates and monitors movement, so that you have coordinated movement. Your brainstem also helps with homeostasis, controls some reflexes. It also monitors some movements, and it also is integrating and relaying information to other parts of your nervous system. Okay, but those are the four main parts: cerebrum, cerebellum, diencephalon, brainstem. Okay. All right, everybody say it with me. Cerebrum, cerebellum, diencephalon, brainstem. Okay. All right, now let's look at lobes. This is the frontal lobe, right? What bone covers the frontal lobe? The frontal bone, right? This is the temporal lobe. What bone typically covers the temporal lobe? Temporal bone. Parietal lobe. What bone typically covers the parietal bone? Or parietal bone covers the parietal lobes. All right, occipital lobe. What bone covers that? Occipital. Okay, what muscle covers that area? Occipitalis. Okay, so that's why we made you learn all those things. Okay. All right. So the outer folds, you see a lot of folds in the brain. The outer folds are gyri, singular gyrus. The indented folds are sulci. The singular version is sulcus. So this line down in the center is the central sulcus. Okay. And the central sulcus is going to separate your frontal lobe from your parietal lobe. This line here along the side of your brain, it's more lateral, is the lateral sulcus. Separates your frontal lobe and parietal lobe from your temporal lobe. Now, all right. Here's the pons, here's medulla oblongata. It's a part of that brainstem. And here's a good view of your cerebellum. Okay, another structure, if you have a large indention or large indented fold, we call that a fissure. So this is your, like we have the anterior median fissure in the spinal cord. This is the longitudinal fissure in your brain, in your cerebrum. Okay. All right, so just like we had meninges in the spinal cord, we have meninges in the brain. Okay. So this layer here, too, it's really, they've kind of divided up, but that's your dura mater. Okay, then we've got an arachnoid mater here in subarachnoid space. And then we've got your pia mater, okay? And then that pia mater connects to your cerebral cortex. Okay, now this layer layer separating the hemispheres, cerebral hemispheres, we call that the falx cerebri, and we'll show you more about that. These places where you have these veins, we call that the dural sinus. Okay, again, it's part of that dura mater. It's your dural sinus. Okay, here's another view here of the dura mater, arachnoid mater, subarachnoid space, pia mater, cerebral cortex. Sometimes part of that subarachnoid space pokes out into the dura mater. Okay, so you get this arachnoid villus breaks through the dura mater. Okay, this is an arachnoid villus. Again, here's your cerebral cortex, cerebellum. There's your medulla oblongata, this little fold there, and your spinal cord. So here, these are the folds, the dural folds that separate regions of your brain and spinal cord. So this is your falx cerebri, separates the cerebral hemispheres. You've got the tentorium cerebelli, separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum. Okay, back here you have falx cerebelli. Okay, it's going to separate the cerebellar hemispheres. Okay, but these are your three dural folds: falx cerebri, falx cerebelli, and tentorium cerebelli. With the falx, each of them will separate hemispheres. Okay, tentorium separates cerebrum from cerebellum. All right, so do one more, ventricles. So your brain has ventricles, they're chambers, just like you have chambers in your heart. So inside the ventricles, you have these two ventricles next to each other. So we call these lateral ventricles. And they connect through this inner ventricular foramen, remember that's a hole, to the third ventricle. And then we have a cerebral aqueduct that connects them, the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle. So back, I think where Timmy is, let's see, it looks like we've got those ventricle models there, but you can see those in a few minutes, okay? All right, lateral ventricles, interventricular foramen, third ventricle, cerebral aqueduct, fourth ventricle. All right, Those feed into the central canal. All right, so let's talk about parts of the brain, the meninges and dural folds, and your ventricles. You can do that with your partner. You can do that at home as well. Okay, so main thing I kind of want you to see here, again, you got your central sulcus, frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe. And here's the parietal occipital sulcus. So it's separating your parietal lobe from your occipital lobe. Okay, here's your diencephalon region. There's your thalamus, your hypothalamus, pineal gland. This is your corpus callosum. It connects your cerebral hemispheres together. Okay, it's how the cerebral hemispheres are able to talk to each other. Okay, just inferior to that, that's your lateral ventricle and your fornix. Okay. All right, there's part of your temporal lobe. You can see that. It's again, this is your cerebellum. Looks kind of like a tree. They call it arbor vitae. All right, and as far as your brainstem, you have your midbrain, pons is the kind of large oval-shaped area, and medulla oblongata. That kind of points right there. So midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata, MPM. That forms your brainstem. Okay. All right. Some more structures. Again, this is the corpus callosum. Okay, and this structure, kind of where the lateral ventricle is, we're going to call this region here septum pellucidum. Okay, again, there's your fornix. And this area in here, we call that choroid plexus. Okay, there's your thalamus and the pineal gland. Okay, call this the anterior commissure. Remember, that's another region where you get connection or communication between the hemispheres, cerebral hemispheres. You got your hypothalamus. You can see a little bit here of your optic chiasm and optic nerve. Optic nerve's down here. We'll show you a better view of that in just a second. Optic chiasm is where the two optic nerves come together. Okay, and again, there's your cerebellum. Okay, so last thing I want to go over with you are the cranial nerves. So things that you want to know, this is your olfactory tract. At the end of the olfactory tract is the olfactory bulb. Okay, it's essentially your first cranial nerve. Second cranial nerve, again, well, while we're on that, olfactory has to do with your what? Anybody know? Your nose, right? So it's sense of smell. All right. So that's how that kind of information gets to your brain. Optic nerves, cranial nerve number 2. Okay, and the nerves meet each other at the optic chiasm. Okay, down here you can also see the optic tract. Okay, but that's processing the visual information your eyes, take in. All right. So we also have here trigeminal nerve, vagus nerve, medulla oblongata, spinal cord. Here's your cerebellum, your pons. But these are the cranial nerves we want you to know. Okay, so you notice they're not all listed. Okay, but these are the cranial nerves we want you to know. So mainly olfactory, optic, trigeminal, vagus. Okay. And then there's your medulla oblongata and your spinal cord. All right, so we are going to finish up here. Okay, we're going to conclude the video, and in the next video we will cover special senses. All right.